welcome to the fifth installment of the series we're running at Fiskal about business software and the latest trends in accounting. Today we've got Christo with us. Christo, thanks for joining.
Thank you.
And Christo, before we get into it, tell me a bit about your journey before joining us as our Chief Operations Officer.
Yeah, cool. So I started my career as any typical accountant would. Started articles, then moved over to financial management in a manufacturing company. Then I went into consulting where I set up systems for companies. So that's where I earned my stripes in Xero, Cin7 Core, and all the other softwares that integrate with them. So I ran implementation teams for a few years, and then I moved to a distribution company, and they do distribution and also a bit of direct to consumer, and I ran the operations there for a couple of years, and then transitioned into just the role here in Fiskal.
Awesome. Christo, but then tell me, what are the systems that you work with? You mentioned Cin7 Core, you mentioned Xero.
Yeah, Odoo as well, implemented Odoo for, I think as this industry goes, it's companies across the whole world, so companies in all the way from Australia through to Europe to the US. MRP Easy with some of the software I use, Katana. A lot of the things that companies are still using today were some of the softwares I implemented. Then, as I mentioned, a lot of the tools that integrate with that. So Shopify, obviously, our WooCommerce, Lightspeed. A lot of the whole ecosystem, I suppose, that is necessary to run any distribution and also e-commerce business.
Was that mainly the client that you implemented those systems for? Was it e-commerce and distribution businesses?
Predominantly, yes. Also, some of them had a bit of a manufacturing piece as well. A lot of co-manufacturing or outsourced manufacturing also happened, where they buy in the raw materials and they actually send it to a different place to get manufactured, then get it back in. A lot of importers also, obviously, as you see with the e-commerce and just distribution companies. So dealt a lot of landed costs and all those kind of things, as you would imagine, for those businesses. So that was the main, but also dealt with just other smaller and random, I suppose, businesses.
And then you moved over to the distribution company, you said?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, and I mean now, what would you say is the key difference between doing the systems implementations and then running the operations for one of those distribution businesses?
Well, one of the main reasons I moved over was to see what's the effect of these systems actually on a business. It was a company that used the exact tech stack that was my specialty, so it was quite enticing for me to see, okay, I would have implemented this system, but how does it affect the day-to-day? And that's really the difference, to see how I can use the data that comes out of the system to really start making decisions and do better planning, stock levels, demand forecasting even, and just managing a warehouse, for instance, all of those components, and doing that day-to-day and really seeing how the system can help. And I was quite impressed, to be honest, to see what can happen if you run the systems or understand the systems well enough to run them properly.
Now that's an interesting point. What do you see now, having seen both parts of one is implementing the system and then as an operations or head of operations running the systems and working with the data, what do you see missing between those two different perspectives?
I think a lot of operations managers or just business owners know intuitively what they want out of a system, but they don't necessarily know how to get it, or sometimes yeah, maybe the access to information or just knowing what to look out for, really. And then making sure that you build. So the system must speak to your operations and your processes, but also the other way around. You must also adjust your way of doing work to the system a bit. So that was like a key difference for me. But yeah, the access to information and actually using the information and making sure the system is clean so that you can use the information. That's also the thing. Not having old, unprocessed data in the system. Making sure that your stock takes are up to date. That you can actually trust the figures. And that's, I suppose, the main key difference. Because if you implement it, you give the client a clean slate in many cases. So they have this great starting point, but it's up to them to then take it further and ensure that they keep it clean and can actually use the system to make decisions. That's why we do it, right?
And an interesting aspect about your experience as well is you started out as in financial management in a manufacturing business. How do you see that interplay between operations, working with the systems, and financial management?
I think it's so intertwined that it's difficult for me to, in my head, to actually split it out. It's impossible. Let's use just a stock take for an example. It's impossible to say with confidence that this is the stock value on my balance sheet if you're not sure that the stock takes are happening, if they're, once a month or cycle counts or whatever the case might be. Same with setting up the correct, costing method in your system. That directly translates to your ability to properly manage your financials. So for me, it's become so interlinked that it's almost impossible for me to split it. I think it's such a crucial part of financial management to make sure that you understand the systems.
And that's really what one of my questions come from, because as you know, part of the tech stack that we use and that you have got experience in, as you mentioned, is Cin7 Core and Xero, and there's this data flow between these two systems. And what I see a lot of times is, from a financial controller or a bookkeeper point of view, them not knowing what to do with the data they receive or how to validate that data to ensure that data is correct, and not interacting with Cin7 Core as diving into the system.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think you touched on quite a few aspects there. I think the starting point, I suppose, is understanding where you put what information in, right? So to ensure that you can trust that all your inventory related transactions are actually happening within Cin7 Core, and then making sure that data flows properly into Cin7 and that you understand each of the different transactions and how they flow in and when they flow in, because I think that's the nuance, right? It's not you create a sales order, for instance, that doesn't actually do anything on the accounting level, but it's when you start going into the flow of the sales order when the magic starts happening and the transaction starts flowing through. So even if you don't want to interact with the system as a financial controller or bookkeeper, you need to understand the triggers. So what triggers what? So if you create an invoice in Cin7 Core, what happens? And how does that flow into something like Xero or QBO?
Interesting. So it's almost take a step back, and we first have to understand what is the standard triggers of information in Cin7 Core, and then understand how does that impact the information flow through to Xero before we can start saying how to interact with the data that we're currently receiving.
Absolutely, because otherwise, you won't be able to trust the data, or you'll blindly trust the data. And I think I'm not sure Yeah, blindly trusting the data can be very detrimental.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's so like financial management and operations. You almost say you don't see where the one starts and the other one ends. Now we're
Exactly.
sitting in a scenario of if you don't understand that flow, you won't be able to validate. You won't be able to validate the data or work with the data.
Yeah, and if you just take it at face value, there could be mistakes coming through. And unfortunately, the mistakes are mostly user driven, but and many times just accidents from misuse of the system. But if you don't know how the data comes through, you won't know how to go investigate that. And yeah, I think there's a lot to that part. So yeah, I'm even if you don't know the technical side of it, you have to know how the data flows.
Yes. So if we take a step back now and we say, okay, we're looking to reconcile our data between Cin7 Core and Xero. What are those triggers that you mentioned, and what data flows do they trigger?
Yeah, sure. So I think Cin7 Core is I really like the way they handle it. So you've got your sales orders, you've got your purchase orders. So that's, as it says, your sales flow and your purchase flow. Then you've got your stock related transactions, which are your adjustments, write-offs, stock takes. And each of those has its own nuances, but I'll just start at the top. So your sales order has the different, let's say, tabs in the workflow. So you create your quote, nothing happens on the accounting side. You authorize your sales order, nothing happens. It actually just reserves the stock in the system, but it doesn't have an accounting impact. The moment that you authorize your invoice, that's when it starts, right? So the moment you authorize your invoice, that's actually sends an invoice down to Xero or QBO. So that's the first thing, and that would be your sales price, would be your your credit and your debit. Yeah. So that's pretty straightforward, but it decouples your cost of sales or cost of goods sold from the invoice. So the only transaction that happens there is your debtors credit your sales. Okay, but nothing has happened on your cost of goods sold.
That's interesting, because usually in the way finance is taught,
Yes.
to a lot of, I would say, at school or at varsity or college, is that sales is directly linked to a cost of sales transaction, and you just mentioned it's decoupled.
Exactly. So that what that means is it can happen on a different date, and it is when the stock actually flows out of your business. So that is a major difference from the traditional accounting mindset, I suppose. So yeah, the moment that you've fully fulfilled your stock, so and that could even be a part of the stock that was sold. So let's say you've sold 10 units on your invoice, but you only send out 5, and you shipped 5. Those 5 will the cost of goods sold will flow through for those 5 units. So that means that you can have multiple cost of goods sold transactions for one sales invoice. And at different dates.
Which makes sense, because if I was to do a stock take, as of today, if I've only have a partially fulfilled invoice, I need to know what the actual theoretical quantity on hand is. So I can't deduct a full invoice if it wasn't fulfilled fully. So that partial fulfillment makes sense. So the system is about accurate theoretical quantity on hand.
Yeah, it's very practical. Yeah. So just to be clear, so you have to, in Cin7 Core, you have to pick, pack, and ship. And only on the ship, that's the trigger for the cost of goods sold. So the reverse happens when you do a credit note. It debits your sales, credit your debtor, and then on the return, obviously, credits your cost of goods sold debits your inventory. So that's that part. Now, when you start talking about receiving payments, that's when the interaction with the debtor actually happens. So if you receive a payment on your invoice, it debits bank, creates the debtor. So yeah.
Wow, so one transaction has got, we just went through a couple of triggers, and if each is happening on their own, they're standalone triggers. So if I have an invoice, it could be an invoice that's partially fulfilled but unpaid.
Yeah.
Or I could have a paid invoice or a customer that's paid. Is this even possible? I've got a customer that's paid on a sales order,
on a quote,
and it has been fulfilled. So
then it has to be on a sales order. It won't be on a quote, but yeah, definitely on a.
So it basically gives you that flexibility for real world scenarios.
It basically splits payments, actual sales transactions, and the stock movement. It splits those three.
Are there three different flows and different interactions?
Could be at different times, yeah. And could be separate transactions even. You can have two payments come in on one sales order. You could have two invoices on one sales order. You could have multiple shipments on an invoice or a sales order without the invoice yet.
Basically real world scenarios.
That's what happens in reality, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
100%. So now that we know all these different triggers, and that they could be, that we have to understand the triggers first of how the system works, what would you say is the next step that we need to consider before looking at reconciling our data between Cin7 and Xero QBO?
Yeah, so if you know, obviously you need to look at the purchase triggers as well, which is pretty much the inverse. So I'm pretty sure you'll be able to figure
we just ran through sales.
We haven't even started the
purchase side.
The purchase is pretty much the same thing. It also decouples the inventory from the bill. So, but that's just when you receive the supplier invoice or the bill, that's the one part, and then when you receive the stock, that's the other part. And you can also have a credit note where you receive a credit note and send back stock. So it's pretty much just the inverse. So I think if you understand the sales side, you will understand the purchaser side. Also, you can have multiple receipts on one order, a purchase order. So that's pretty much the same thing.
Sorry, another question is, when I talk about supply, something that I thought about now is foreign currency transactions, because a lot of the customers that I've dealt with from a financial controller or a financial planning and analysis point of view have got they import from various either European countries or Chinese corporations, and there's forex involved in those purchase orders that you just mentioned when I purchase stock from a supplier.
Yeah, so that gets handled by the system automatically. So you can handle multiple currencies. You can pay in one currency but have the invoice in a different currency. So, and vice versa. So that it handles it pretty smoothly. It's not something to really stress about. It's something that you have to learn to understand. But yeah, I think if you look at realized currency gains and losses versus unrealized currency gains and losses, there are some nuances there, but if you think about what a realized currency gain or loss is looks at the value of the invoice and the amount that you paid, and works out that versus the current exchange rate.
So it also decouples that from the stock. So I don't have to, if I've got multi-currency enabled, I can use the foreign currency that I'm being invoiced in from the supplier, and it does those conversions and those recalculations.
Correct. Okay. Yeah. I think a big nuance for especially those type of clients are the landed costs, right? So all those duties or shipping costs or freight costs, that is a real cost that you need to add.
Or as Trump says, tariffs.
Tariffs, exactly. Real cost that you need to add to your stock value. there is a mechanism to do that. Maybe we don't go into much detail right now about that. But yeah, also important to just note. Then before we go into the next step, just with the stock write-offs and adjustments and stock takes, that's a pretty straightforward journal that flows through the moment that you do the transaction. There's an effective date that you can choose, and that's the data that the journal flows through. So and that could be a debit your stock or credit your stock, depending on what happened. You will choose your own. You will choose the account. There are default accounts, but you will choose the account that it writes it off to, or writes it back to.
So that's an interesting point. So when we went through the steps and the triggers, you mentioned things as debit stock, credit cost of goods sold, or debit debtor and credit sales for the different steps. Now you mention that you choose the accounts.
Correct. So you can set up default accounts in Cin7 Core for most of the transactions. So as I mentioned, for the adjustments, the write-offs, any of those would be default accounts already set up if you've set up your Cin7 Core account correctly and completely. But you can also make adjustments to that on a per transaction level.
Okay.
In most cases, you don't have to touch it. If it's set up, you just go ahead and do that, and it will flow through to the correct accounts. But as a financial manager, you should know where to expect the flows to come to. Right?
Yeah, if I'm expected to reconcile, the first step you mentioned is understanding the triggers. Now the second step is this: you need to know the design or the mapping of those accounts. Like where is it sending that information of the different triggers that you mentioned?
Yeah. So that's for sure. You definitely need to understand that and make sure that it aligns with what makes sense in your company. So, and I suppose from a operational level, make sure that somebody doesn't go change it on a per transaction level where it shouldn't be changed. So also building in processes to ensure that a stock write-off journal doesn't go to your advertising costs by accident, because that's a reality. It could.
Now computers do only what you tell them to do.
Exactly. So once you've got your mapping sorted out, there are also your integration settings. You need to choose: do you want auto syncs to happen or not? It's up to you. We prefer actually not having auto sync on in some of the cases. I would say actually most cases, just because it gives you an opportunity to make correct any mistakes before it flows into Xero or QBO. So that's quite an interesting one. If you are comfortable with your operations and you get to a place where it's humming, I suppose you can turn it on and it can flow through correctly. The main thing is we just want to make sure that there aren't any sync errors, right? We want to prevent that.
So just to stop you, a sync, what do you mean by a sync or auto sync?
So auto sync is basically saying that I am allowing data to flow from Cin7 Core to my accounting software. So that's how it's typically the integration flow. So you can choose to have it auto sync, so it goes in by itself, or obviously manually, where you say I want to sync right now. The thing is, if you make mistakes in Cin7 Core, it can cause sync errors. So maybe you've made adjustments to already authorized invoices that have already flowed into Xero. We've already received the payment, so it's not possible for you to make any adjustments. It will block that. So that would cause a sync error. And there are myriads of other reasons why sync errors occur. And we obviously want to make sure from an operational perspective that we don't do, I would say, make unnecessary adjustments to already authorized transactions within Cin7 Core to ensure that we don't get those sync errors, because otherwise you need to clear them out, validate them, go through a whole process to make sure that all the correct transactions flowed through.
And am I understanding at a fundamental level this correctly? A sync error basically means that the information is not the same between the two systems now.
Correct. That is it. And obviously that causes a bit of alarm. You don't want that. There are some of the sync errors that might be it couldn't sync through your document attachments properly or something like that, which are less of a worry than something like it couldn't sync through your invoice properly. And then maybe some adjustment was made there, and you need to make sure that the data on the Cin7 Core side gets reflected properly in your Xero or QBO or accounting software.
Perfect. Wow, I mean that was a lot of things to look out for, and we haven't even started with our matching our information between our accounting records and our inventory system yet. Before going into other steps or down the line, is there anything else at this point in time that you would want that we should look out for, or that anyone watching this video should watch out for?
Yeah, so I think there are quite a few choices that you can make when you set up your integration between Cin7 Core and Xero. I think I would definitely advise it if you have something like an e-commerce channel, that you consolidate the transactions. So I would consolidate the invoices, the payments, as well as the cost of goods sold journals, and those are settings that you can set up, especially for those high volume transactions, because otherwise you're probably going to bog down your accounting system with unnecessary detail. So you can access that detail in Cin7 Core at any time. So there's no reason to really push all of that into your accounting system. So that's something I would definitely look out for.
And to ask, what does consolidation mean?
So consolidation means typically that it groups all the transactions for one day.
Okay.
Typically, into one invoice and one journal for the cost of goods sold, and then if you have a payment, it pushes down one payment if you're going against control accounts, which you typically use for Cin7 for e-commerce.
In old school accounting, that would be called batch processing.
Batch processing, yeah, for sure. And that's just to ensure that you don't have unnecessary detail in your accounting system.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I can think of now. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm missing something, but yeah.
Well, there's a lot of things to think through before we even start. I think we need to do another session, and then we'll go through the next steps of reconciling our information between our accounting system and our inventory system. But thank you so much for joining us, Christo.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great.